Our passage today comes from Proverbs chapter 4. Hear, O sons, a father's instruction, and be attentive that you may gain insight. For I give you good precepts. Do not forsake my teaching. When I was a son with my father, tender, the only one in the sight of my mother, he taught me and said to me, let your heart hold fast my words, keep my commandments, and live. Get wisdom, get insight. Do not forget, and do not turn away from the words of my mouth. Do not forsake her, and she will keep you. Love her, and she will guard you. The beginning of wisdom is this, get wisdom, and whatever you get insight. Prize her highly, and she will exalt you. She will honor you if you embrace her. She will place on your head a graceful garland. She will bestow on you a beautiful crown. Hear, my son, and accept my words, that the years of your life may be many. I have taught you the way of wisdom. I have led you in the paths of uprightness. When you walk, your step will not be hampered, and if you run, you will not stumble. Keep hold of instruction. Do not let go. Guard her, for she is your life. Do not enter the path of the wicked, and do not walk in the way of evil. Avoid it. Do not go on it. Turn away from it and pass on. For they cannot sleep unless they have done wrong. They are robbed of sleep unless they have made someone stumble. For they eat the bread of wickedness and drink the wine of violence. But the path of the righteous is like the light of dawn, which shines brighter and brighter until full day. The way of the wicked is like deep darkness. They do not know over what they stumble. My son, be attentive to my words. Incline your ear to my sayings. Let them not escape from your sight. Keep them within your heart. For they are life to those who find them, and healing to all their flesh. Keep your heart with all vigilance, for from it flow the springs of life. Put away from you crooked speech, and put devious talk far from you. Let your eyes look directly forward, and your gaze be straight before you. Ponder the path of your feet, then all your ways will be sure. Do not swerve to the right or to the left. Turn your foot away from evil.
Well, thank you, Mackenzie. This morning, we are continuing our sermon series in the book of Proverbs. Chapter 4 is where we are this morning, and I was reminded earlier this week of the importance of this book and the significance of this book in our lives and the wisdom that it provides. Earlier this week, I was eating breakfast, and I was eating a biscuit. And I can't eat a biscuit without putting honey on my biscuit. And so there I am. I grab the honey bottle, and I start squeezing the honey bottle onto my biscuit. And I just don't like a little bit of honey on my biscuit. I like to soak honey all over my biscuit. And so I'm squeezing that bottle. I like it where like that, I take a bite out of the biscuit and the honey just like goes everywhere and makes my hands all sticky and everything like that. That's how much honey I like on my biscuit. Anyway, I'm about to soak this honey in this biscuit. And as I'm doing that, then a proverb comes to mind. Proverbs 25:16, which says, if you have found honey, eat only enough for you, lest you have your fill of it and vomit it. And like, that's really in the Bible. Like, check it out, Proverbs 25:6. I'll give you permission right now. Check it out, Proverbs 25:16. If you have found honey, eat only enough for you, lest you have your fill of it and vomit it. And so I didn't necessarily have that verse memorized, okay? And that's why I had to read it. But I had the gist of that verse. And so at that point in time, I had a choice. Like, do I trust God's wisdom and believe that God knows a whole lot more about honey in my body than I do? Or do I trust my own wisdom and believe that I know more about my body and honey than God does and just continue to squeeze that bottle and eat 20 more biscuits soaked in honey? So I was kind of like at a crossroads. Like, what do I do? Well, guess what I did? I showed self-control, and I trusted God's wisdom and not my own wisdom. And I only had one biscuit. And it wasn't like completely soaked with honey either. Just a few little drops of honey on it. And it was awesome. It was good. So I know that's like a really, really silly example. But the reality is that issue, that crossroads, right? That question is the crossroads, the question that we're confronted with every day. That we're faced with every single day of our lives. It's the question of whether or not we're going to trust God's wisdom. It's the question of whether or not we really believe, if we really trust that God is wise enough and that God really knows what He's talking about when it comes to all areas of life. When it comes to the area of sexuality and money and work and friendships and parenting and conflict resolution and emotions and honey and everything else. Like the question we're faced with all day long is, do we trust and really believe that God is wise in what He has said about these things and that He knows what He's talking about when it comes to these things? Or do we believe that we're wise and we really know what we're talking about when it comes to these things? Like that issue right there, that's the ultimate root of sin, isn't it? Like that's the issue that's going to determine whether we walk in obedience or whether we live in sin. It's the question of, do we trust and have faith in God's wisdom in what He has said about issue X, Y, and Z. So oftentimes we think, yeah, God, I know what you say about parenting, but I'm going to do it this way instead. Or God, I know what you say about friendships and relationships, but this works better for me. God, I know what you say about sexuality, but I'm the exception to the rule. God, I know what you say about speech and how we're to communicate and the words we're supposed to speak, but I prefer to talk more like this. And so then this is one of the big reasons, like why we're going through the book of Proverbs. It's to remind us that God is wise and we're not. And think about that, right? He's the one who designed and created all of these things. He created and designed money. He created and designed emotions. He created and designed friendships. He created and designed marriage. He created and designed our words. He created and designed honey. He created and designed like everything. And so since He created them, then He knows how they work. He knows how they're supposed to function. And so then it only makes sense then that we listen to Him and that we trust Him in His wisdom when it comes to all these different areas of life. He designed how they're supposed to work. And so then when we follow His wisdom in all of these areas, then things will go well. We'll flourish. But when we don't follow Him in His wisdom, and instead we trust our own wisdom in how we do these things and how these things are supposed to work, then it leads to brokenness. And it leads to hurt and pain and everything else. And so then this is what Solomon has been exhorting his son to do in these first 3 chapters of Proverbs that we've looked at over these last few weeks. That if you remember, he's been explaining to his son about the importance of wisdom, about the value of God's wisdom. And he's been exhorting, if you remember, and pleading with his son then to seek God's wisdom, to pursue after God's wisdom. And that's what he's going to continue to do here in chapter 4 this morning. That in this chapter, what we're going to see are 3 different speeches that Solomon the father is going to make to his son. And in each of these speeches, he's going to continue to exhort and plead with his son, and not only his son, but also to us, to follow God's wisdom or pursue after God's wisdom and to live according to God's wisdom. And so then this is my prayer for us during our time this morning. My prayer is this, is that this chapter would help us to see the value of God's wisdom, and as a result cause us to cherish God's wisdom and treasure God's wisdom. And as a result then, in those times of temptation, when we're tempted to trust in our own wisdom as opposed to God's wisdom, then it would remind us then of how valuable God's wisdom is, that in those times of temptation that we would trust in His wisdom then, instead of trusting and following in our own wisdom. And so then here's our first speech, our first exhortation then that Solomon is going to give to his son and that he's going to give to us as well when it comes to wisdom. He's going to exhort us, and you see this on your handout there, that he's going to exhort us to get wisdom, to get wisdom. That's what we see starting in verse 1 there. Look there with me. In verse 1, Solomon the father writes, "Hear, O sons, a father's instruction, and be attentive that you may gain insight. For I give you good precepts. Do not forsake my teaching. When I was a son with my father, tender, the only one in the side of my mother, he taught me and said to me." So then do you see what's going on here in these first 4 verses here? Solomon, the father, is going to pass down to his son the same teaching and the same instruction that his father passed down to him. Does that make sense? We have 3 generations here. Solomon's father instructing Solomon, and now Solomon is taking that instruction and he's passing it down to his sons. Which, if I was smart, this would have made a great Father's Day sermon. But I'm not smart, and so we got to keep going. But here's what Solomon's father, right, David, taught Solomon, and that now Solomon's passing down to his sons. We see it in the rest of verse 4 there. "Let your heart hold fast my words. Keep my commandments and live." Then he says this in verse 5. Here's the teaching he's passing down. "Get wisdom. Get insight." Then he repeats it again there in verse 7. Look there. He says, "The beginning of wisdom is this. Get wisdom, and whatever you get or whatever you do, get insight." And so that's the teaching right there that Solomon received from his father, and now that Solomon's passing down to his son, and that he's exhorting his son to hold fast to and to pay attention to. It's to get wisdom, to get insight. And it's so important to him that he says it not just once, but he says it twice. And so then I know we've mentioned this like a few different times as we've gone throughout Proverbs here, but do you remember what wisdom is? It's all over this book, so let's define this real quick before we just keep going on. What's this wisdom that the father, Solomon, and his father is urging and pleading his sons to get? What exactly is this wisdom? Well, we've talked about it a number of times before, but this word wisdom literally means skill. It means skill, which then begs the question, the skill to do what? Well, this wisdom is the skill within Proverbs, the context of Proverbs. Wisdom is the skill of making godly choices. It's the skill of making godly choices and living a righteous life, meaning discerning right from wrong in all areas of life. And so then I know that's kind of a wordy, clunky sort of definition, but the key point I want us to see here is that when it comes to Proverbs and this whole idea of wisdom, wisdom is a reference to moral wisdom. Moral wisdom. It's not just the wisdom of, should I take this job or that job? Instead, it's moral wisdom. It's the wisdom of making godly choices, discerning right from wrong, knowing the right thing to do in all these different areas of life. And so then wisdom explains the right way to parent. Wisdom explains the right way to handle money. Wisdom explains the right way to communicate and speak to others. Wisdom explains the right way to be a friend. Wisdom explains the right way to live in relationships with others. Wisdom explains the right way to choose a spouse. Wisdom explains the right way to handle our emotions. Wisdom explains how much honey you need to put on your biscuit. Like that's wisdom that Solomon's urging us and his sons to get. But look then at how he describes, I love this, how he describes this wisdom in verse 6. He personifies wisdom as a woman or as a wife. And he exhorts his sons to value and to cherish and to treasure wisdom, just like they would value and treasure and cherish a woman. And you see this, look at verse 6. You see it in verse 6. Just look at these words that he uses. He pleads in verse 6, he says, not to forsake her. And the her here is a reference to wisdom. Then in the second line of verse 6, he says, to love her. Again, the her here is wisdom. Then in verse 8, he says, prize her highly, meaning prize wisdom highly. And finally, in the second line of verse 8, he exhorts his son to embrace her. And that's a real sexual, intimate type term there. But that's a picture here of how he wants his sons, how he wants us to think about and feel about God's wisdom. Like we're to cherish, value, treasure, pursue wisdom, just like we would treasure and value and pursue a spouse. We're to love it, we're to prize it, we're to embrace it, we're not to forsake it, just like we would our spouse. Like that's how precious and valuable God's wisdom should be to us. And just think about that. This is huge to grasp. Because here's why. Because if we don't feel this way about God's wisdom, like if God's wisdom isn't as valuable to us as our spouse, if that's not true of you, if it's not supremely valuable to you, then guess what? You're probably not going to follow it. You're probably not going to listen to it. In those times where you're tempted, should I trust my wisdom? Should I trust God's wisdom? Well, God's wisdom's not very valuable, so I'm going to trust my wisdom instead. Your ability to trust God's wisdom in those times where it's really, really hard, and in those times where you really, really rather trust your own wisdom, is going to be contingent upon and dependent upon how much you cherish, value, and treasure His wisdom. How much you treasure and value it will be exposed by whether or not you trust it and follow it and obey it. One of the reasons, though, we're to value His wisdom is because all the blessings and the benefits that come from His wisdom. Did you notice that there in verses 6 through 9 there? That He just gives this long list of blessings and benefits and rewards that come with embracing and following and cherishing God's wisdom. And so you see some of these blessings and benefits here. Look at verse 6. He says that wisdom will keep us and guard us. Meaning God's wisdom, it will keep us and guard us from evil. It will keep us and guard us from unrighteousness. It will keep us and guard us from living foolishly and keep us and guard us from death. But that's not all in verse 8. He says that wisdom will exalt you and honor you. And then he goes on in verse 9, he says, she will place on your head a graceful garland. She will bestow on you a beautiful crown. So then verse 9 here, it's basically just an illustration of how wisdom will exalt us and honor us. That in that day a crown would be made out of garland and placed on someone's head as a sign of honor, as a sign of glory to exalt that person. And so then that's a picture of what wisdom will do for us. What wisdom will do for those who treasure it and embrace it. It will ultimately lead to our honor. It will ultimately lead to our glory and our exaltation, which is probably a reference, the twofold reference here. Number one, it's probably a reference to us living an honorable life in the eyes of others here in this life. But most importantly, it's a reference to the ultimate glory and honor and exaltation that's to come in the life to come. These are the blessings, the benefits for those who get wisdom, and why we should cherish and treasure and value wisdom. Second exhortation or speech that Solomon gives to us then is this. It's to keep walking on the path of wisdom, to keep walking on the path of wisdom. This is what we're going to see in verses 10 through 19 here. In other words, what we're going to see in the second speech, and it's important to see how the second speech relates to the first speech. So in the first speech, he simply says to get wisdom. But getting wisdom isn't like this one-time decision. We get it, and then we're like, okay, I'm done. Instead, we get wisdom, but then we're to continue to walk on the path of wisdom. We're to continue to walk in wisdom and walk according to wisdom and walk on the path of wisdom. It's not just a one-time deal where we're done with it, but it's a day-by-day, moment-by-moment decision of continuing to walk on the path of wisdom and in wisdom. And so then that's the main focus here in the second speech in verses 10 through 19 here. That if you notice here, you might want to underline these and circle these as we go along in these verses here, but over and over again, we're going to see language of a path and walking and stumbling. It's this two-path sort of imagery of life being a journey. And on this journey, and we've talked about this before all throughout Proverbs, but on this journey there are these two paths. There's the path of wisdom and righteousness that leads to life, and then there's the path of foolishness and unrighteousness that leads to death. And so then the whole point of this second speech here is that Solomon, and just feel the emotion of Solomon here, he's pleading with his son to follow, to keep, to stay on the path of wisdom, the path of righteousness that leads to life. And he's pleading with the son to avoid the path of folly and the path of evil and the path of unrighteousness that leads to death. And we see this path language, this way language, this walking language, this stumbling language over and over again all throughout this passage. And this is huge for us to remember by point of application here before we jump into these verses. Because in those moments where we're tempted to reject God's wisdom and instead to follow our own wisdom, or to follow the path of foolishness and the path of unrighteousness and the wicked path, in those moments where we're tempted to do that, then in those moments we need to remember what's at stake here and what's happening here in these two paths that are set before us. One leads to life. The other leads to death. And so then that's what he's reminding us here within these speeches and within this section here. He gives us essentially, and you see these on your handout here, but two reasons essentially for why we should keep walking on the path of wisdom and avoid the path of the wicked. And these are the two reasons we need to remember as we walk, and especially in the midst of temptation. We need to remember these two reasons. The first reason, or the first truth that we need to remember is this, and you see it on your handout there, is we need to remember the results or rewards, if you'd rather use that word, of walking in wisdom. Remember the results or rewards of walking in wisdom. And we see these results or rewards there starting in verse 10 all the way down through verse 13. Solomon says this. He says, "Hear, my son, and accept my words, that the years of your life may be many. I've taught you the way of wisdom. I've led you in the paths of uprightness. When you walk, your step will not be hampered. And if you run, you will not stumble. Keep hold of instruction. Do not let it go. Guard her, for she is your life." And so what Solomon's doing, he's explaining, here's the results, here's the benefits, here's the rewards of wisdom and walking in wisdom. And he mentions two different results or rewards here that come as a result of walking according to God's wisdom. And these specific ones aren't on your hand up there, so you're going to have to do some work here and write them in. But the first result or reward is this. It's life. It's life. He mentions this. Did you notice that? He mentions this 2 times within these 4 verses here. First time he mentions it is in the second line there in verse 10. He says, he tells his son he exhorts his son to accept his words of wisdom, and then he tells him why. He says that the years of your life may be many. And so you read that, right? And you think, that Solomon can't mean what I think he means here, right? That if we follow his words of wisdom in these Proverbs and follow God's wisdom, that we'll live longer than those who don't. He can't be saying that. That's exactly what he's saying. That's 100% exactly what he means here. Like, this is important. This isn't a 100% guaranteed, ironclad promise, because God's sovereign and there's a whole lot of different exceptions. At the same time, generally speaking, if you live your life according to the wise instructions in this book and the Proverbs in this book, and you follow God's wisdom, then you're going to live longer. You'll live a longer life than those who reject God's wisdom, and those who live foolishly, and those who live a life of evil in this world. And practically speaking, like, that just makes sense. There's a lot of things, a lot of heartache, and a lot of pain, a lot of potential danger that you're going to avoid if you follow and walk according to God's wisdom. The second time he mentions life, though, is there in the second line of verse 13. Look there with me. He says, keep hold of instruction, do not let go. Guard her. And why? For she is your life. It's important to note here that the word life here in verse 13, it's used differently than the way the word life is used in verse 10. The word life in verse 10 is just a reference to our life here on earth being longer, while the life in verse 13 is a reference to life eternal, meaning eternal life. But that's the end result, right? That's the end result of the path of wisdom and walking wisdom, following wisdom. The end result is eternal life. And so then remember that, right? In those moments you're tempted. I'm not going to follow the path of wisdom. I'm not going to live according to God's wisdom. Instead, I'm going to follow the wicked path. Well, remember what you're doing when that happens. You're rejecting wisdom. You're rejecting the wisdom of this book that leads to life. And instead, you're choosing the wicked path that leads to death. And so then, listen, that doesn't make sense. Why in the world would anybody choose a path that leads to death? Doesn't make any sense. So we choose the path that leads to life. So that's the first result, the first reward of living according to God's wisdom. It leads to life. The second result, or reward then, of living according to God's wisdom is that it keeps us from stumbling. Keeps us from stumbling. It's what Solomon says in the rest of the very beginning there in verse 12, He says this. He says, when you walk, your step will not be hampered. And if you run, you will not stumble. So when Solomon talks about not being hampered here, or not stumbling here, he means not stumbling into foolishness, not stumbling into wickedness, not stumbling into unrighteousness and sin and evil. Which makes sense, right? If you're walking in wisdom, if you're making godly choices, if you're living your life according to God's wisdom, then you're not going to stumble into sin. You're not going to be hampered by wickedness and evil and unrighteousness. Instead, you're going to live a godly life and be growing in righteousness and holiness because you're living your life according to God's wisdom. And there's a correlation between those two things, right? That if you want to live a righteous life, if you want to grow in holiness in your life, the only way to do that is to live according to God's wisdom. The world's wisdom will not produce righteousness in you. Your wisdom will not produce righteousness in you. Only God's wisdom will produce righteousness in you. So then follow God's wisdom. Secondly, then, we need to remember the danger of the path of the wicked. Remember the danger of the path of the wicked. This is what Solomon goes on to say there in verse 14. Look there in verse 14. He gives this warning. He says, do not enter the path of the wicked, and do not walk in the way of the evil. Avoid it. Do not go on it. Turn away from it and pass on. And so then just feel, right, for a moment, the intensity of a father who loves his son, who is pleading with his son. Avoid the evil path. Don't go on the evil path. Don't walk in the way of the wicked. Avoid it. Turn away from it. Just keep walking by it. Pass by it. Don't walk on it. And so then the obvious question is why? Like, why is Solomon so adamant with his son that his son doesn't walk on the wicked path? Why is he so adamant that his son doesn't walk on the wicked path? Well, he tells us in verse 16. Look there with me. He says, "For they," meaning those on the path of the wicked, "they cannot sleep unless they have done wrong. They are robbed of sleep unless they have made someone stumble. For they eat the bread of wickedness and drink the wine of violence." So do you see there why Solomon is so adamant that his son doesn't go on the wicked path? It's because this wicked path, it's filled with people who won't, just listen to this, who won't go to sleep until they've made someone stumble. They won't go to sleep until they cause someone to join them in their sin and in their evil. This wicked path, it's filled with people who are involved in all sorts of gross wickedness and evil and violence and unrighteousness. And so he's like, avoid it. Don't go on it. Just keep passing by it. In contrast, though, to this wicked path, look what he says about the path of the righteous. We see it in verse 18. He says, "But the path of the righteous is like the light of dawn, which shines brighter and brighter until full day. The way of the wicked is like deep darkness. They do not know over what they stumble." In other words, what he's saying here is that the path of the righteous, those who are on the path of the righteous, they can see where they're going. They can avoid obstacles. They can avoid stumbling blocks along the way because they're on the path that's filled with light. While those who are on the path of the wicked, they walk in darkness. And because they're walking in darkness, you ever walked in a dark room? I was staying in a hotel room this past week, got up to go to the bathroom at 4 o'clock in the morning, and ran into a stool right in my kneecap. It hurt. It wasn't fun. That's the picture of what he's describing here. That those who walk in darkness are tripped up. They stumble into sin. They stumble into wickedness and evil in their lives. That's the path of the wicked. And so put all this in application for us. Like, this is what needs to come to our minds. Like this vivid imagery of these two paths and what characterizes each of these paths in those moments of temptation. When we're tempted to trust in our own wisdom, reject God's wisdom. When we're tempted to follow the path of the wicked instead of the path of the righteous. That in those times, instead of looking at the path of the wicked and it appealing pleasurable and attractive and appealing and all these things, false promises that it holds out to us that looks really good at the moment. Instead, we need to be able to knock some sense into us and to come to our senses and to be able to say, that path isn't attractive. That path isn't appealing. It doesn't offer the pleasure that it seems to offer. Instead, that path is filled with darkness. That path is filled with wickedness. That path fills with people who won't go to sleep until they can bring me down. And that path ultimately leads to death. So why in the world would I go on that path? And instead, we choose to walk along the path of the wise path and the path of the righteous and trust God's wisdom and to follow God's wisdom, even if it doesn't make sense and even if every emotion and every desire inside of us is saying, go there. This imagery of these two paths are one of God's primary ways to keep us from walking and following into sin and instead to follow the wise path and live a life according to His wisdom. This then leads to this third and final exhortation Solomon gives, which is this. It's kind of a weird one, but it's this. It's to use your whole body, like every body part, to stay on the path of wisdom. To use your whole body to stay on the path of wisdom. It's what Solomon says in the very final, third and final speech of this chapter here in verses 20 through 27, that what he's going to do is he's going to mention all these different body parts. Like, I'll identify them here in just a minute, but you might want to underline them or circle them as we go through in verses 20 through 27. But he's going to mention all these different body parts, and he's going to explain how each of these body parts play an important role in keeping us on the path of wisdom. All these different body parts play an important role in us continuing to live according to God's wisdom. So the first body part that he mentions here is the ear. And with our ears, he tells us that we're to listen to wisdom. We're to listen to wisdom. This is the point Solomon makes there at the very beginning there of the third speech in verse 20. He says, "My son, be attentive to my words, incline your ear to my sayings." So Solomon here, he's exhorting his son and us to hear his wise sayings, to listen to his proverbs, to listen to his wise words, his wise instructions. So this is really important, right? This is one of the ways that we're to receive wisdom, one of the ways in which we're to keep on the path of wisdom and to continue to live according to God's wisdom. One of the ways we do that is with our ears. It's by continually and repeatedly listening to wisdom. And so then here's the question we all need to answer then. If that's true, then think about your week, a normal week. Like, what are you listening to? I mean, really think about it. Regularly, consistently, just a normal day, a normal week, what and who are you listening to? What is going into these ears? Everything from music to podcasts to shows to movies to people you listen to sermons you listen to, and on and on and on and on. Like, if you want to continually and faithfully live on the path of wisdom and according to God's wisdom, that it's imperative that we continually and regularly listen to God's wisdom. Secondly, he mentions the eyes. And with our eyes, he tells us that we're to see wisdom. So what he says next in verse 21, look there with me. He says, "Let them," meaning the wise sayings he's talking about here that he's teaching his son, "let them," these wise sayings, "not escape from your sight." In other words, if we want to continue on this path of wisdom and living according to God's wisdom, then we can't let God's wisdom escape from our sight. We need to continually see and behold and fix our eyes upon God's wisdom and His wise sayings and His wise instructions. And so think about that. What are you looking at in a normal day, in a normal week? What are you focusing on? What are you looking at? What are you beholding? What are you fixing your eyes upon? Are you fixing your eyes upon God's wisdom? Are you spending time in this book, beholding, fixing your eyes upon the wisdom of God, page after page after page after page? Or are you just fixing your eyes upon the wisdom of the world? Thirdly, then, he mentions the heart. He tells us that if we want to continue to walk in wisdom and live according to God's wisdom, we need to guard our hearts. That's what he says at the very end, the last line there in verse 21, extending through verse 23. He says, "Keep them within your heart, for they are life to those who find them, and healing to all their flesh. Keep your heart with all vigilance, for from it flow the springs of life." When Solomon here mentions the heart here, he's referring to a whole lot more than just the affections and emotions and the desires in our hearts. Like, don't get me wrong, that's part of it, but the heart in the Old Testament is a reference not just to affections and desires and emotions in our hearts, but the heart in the Old Testament is a reference to our whole person. It's a reference to our mind, our will, and our emotions. Or another way to put it, it's in reference to our thoughts, our decisions or choices, and our desires. And so then Solomon here is saying that we need to keep, and that word keep could also be translated as the word guard. Now, that's probably a better idea here. We need to guard our hearts. We need to guard our mind. We need to guard our thoughts. We need to guard our desires. We need to guard our affections and our emotions with all vigilance. And this makes sense, right? If we want to stay on the path of wisdom and continue to live according to God's wisdom, then we need to be careful. We need to guard what we let into our minds. We need to guard what we let into our thoughts. We need to guard what we let into our hearts. In other words, we need to be vigilant about what we think about, what we daydream about, what we process through in our minds. We need to be vigilant about what we desire, the affections, the emotions, the desires, what we long for in our hearts. And the reason we need to be vigilant of that is because what he says at the very end of verse 23 is because from our hearts flow the springs of life. What that means is that we live and act out of our thoughts and desires. We live and act out of what we think and what we desire. And so then if our thoughts and desires are consumed with unrighteousness and evil and wickedness and sin and things that are contrary to God's wisdom, then that's how we're going to live. That's going to be the springs of life. But if our thoughts and our desires are filled with the wisdom of God, then that's how we're going to live. That's going to be the springs of life. The next body part Solomon mentions then is our mouth. He says that with our mouth we're to speak righteous words of wisdom. That's what he says in verse 24. He says, put away from you crooked speech, and put devious talk far from you. In verse 25 then, he mentions, the next body part he mentions is our eyes again. And he says that with our eyes, we're to keep our eyes focused on the path of wisdom. That's what he says in verse 25. Look there with me. He says, let your eyes look directly forward and your gaze be straight before you. In other words, as we're walking the path of wisdom, just keep looking ahead. Like, don't look over there at the path of foolishness. Don't look over there at the wicked path, because you could be enticed and tempted by that. So don't look at that. Just keep looking ahead at wisdom. Keep looking ahead at the path of wisdom. Don't be looking at the wicked path over here. And then finally, the last body part he mentions is our feet. And with our feet, he says we're to keep walking straight on the path of wisdom. That's what he says in the final two verses here. Look at verse 26. He says, ponder the path of your feet, then all your ways will be sure. Do not swerve to the right or to the left. Turn your foot away from evil. In other words, he's saying just keep walking forward. Just stay on the path of wisdom. Don't start veering over here toward the wicked path. Don't start veering over here toward the path of evil. Just keep walking in a straight line. Don't veer to the right. Don't veer to the left. Just keep walking in a straight line. Living according to God's wisdom, following the path of God's wisdom. So then this right here, right? This is what's required. This is what it takes to live, continue to live, and stay on the path of wisdom. This is what it requires and what it's going to take to continue to live according to God's wisdom and avoid the path of the wicked. Like, think about this. It's literally going to require every body part, every part of your body, from your eyes and what you see and look at, from your ears and what you listen to your mouths and the words that you speak, to your hearts and what you let into your thoughts and your mind and what you let into your heart and your desires, to your feet and the places that you go. All of those things, all of it is ultimately going to determine whether or not you're going to continue to stay on the path of wisdom and live a life of righteousness that leads to life, or whether you're going to end up going on the path of the wicked that ultimately leads to death. It's going to require every part of our body. So then, within this chapter, Solomon's given us 3 speeches, 3 exhortations, all reminding us of our need and the value of wisdom. He's exhorted us to get wisdom. But once we get wisdom, he exhorts us then to keep walking in wisdom. And the way that we're to keep walking in wisdom is to use all of our body to stay on the path of wisdom. That's the value, and that's the instruction that Solomon has given to us this morning. And all of that is good. And all of that is true. And all of that is exactly what we need to do this morning. And as we leave here this morning. At the same time, it's not the full, complete story. Instead, the wisdom that Solomon is referring to here in chapter 4, that wisdom is not just a reference to his wise sayings. It's not just a reference to the wise instructions. It's just not a reference to all the Proverbs in this book. Instead, the wisdom that Solomon is referring to here is ultimately fulfilled in the person of Jesus. That Jesus is the perfect embodiment and the ultimate fulfillment of the wisdom of God that Solomon is referring to here in chapter 4. That Jesus is the wisdom of God in the flesh. In other words, if you want to know what wisdom looks like, then look at Jesus. If you want to know what wisdom sounds like, then listen to Jesus. Like he's the one that all of these proverbs are ultimately pointing to and are fulfilled in. In other words, he's the ultimate path of wisdom. John 14:6, Jesus says, I am the way, meaning I'm the path, I'm the truth, and I'm the life. No one comes to the Father but through me. In other words, Jesus is the ultimate path of wisdom that leads to life. In other words, it's through his righteous life. It's through his substitutionary death. It's through his victorious resurrection that the wise path to life has been opened. There's no other way. There's no other path. There's no other path that ultimately leads to life. Only Jesus, and Jesus being your wisdom, is the only path that ultimately leads to life. So if you want to be wise, you can read all the Proverbs in this book. You can follow all the Proverbs in this book. You can apply and live out all the Proverbs in this book. But if you don't get Jesus and keep walking with Jesus and use every part of your body to follow Jesus, then you won't be wise. Wisdom only comes through Jesus. And in knowing Jesus then, it's only then when we know Jesus then that we'll have a heart posture and a desire then to follow and the power and the ability to follow the wise sayings and the wise instructions in this book. So yes, let's get wisdom. Let's keep following after wisdom. Let's use every body part to stay on the path of wisdom. But let's see how that wisdom is ultimately fulfilled in the person of Jesus. Let's pray together. Lord, thank you for today, and thank you for your word, and thank you for just the reminder, especially for a people who are so tempted to trust ourselves and to think that we know better than you when it comes to so many areas and issues in our lives. Lord, the reality is we know nothing, and we are simply humbled before you, looking to you as our ultimate wisdom and as the ultimate source of wisdom, and the one who can ultimately guide and lead us in wisdom when it comes to our life. And so, Lord, I pray that that would be true of us this morning, that the wisdom that we find and get would ultimately not be found in just wise principles, but it would be found in a wise person, Jesus. And the result of that then would be that we become new creations with new longings, new desires, new thoughts, and a new way of life. That our hearts and our feet would be placed upon the path of wisdom, and that we would follow and live according to your wisdom that would ultimately lead to life. And we pray all these things in the precious name of Jesus. Amen.